So without further ado, it's my great privilege to introduce you to Janet McMahon. Janet is an ecologist who works out of Maine. She authored our Wild Works 2 paper, which is a white paper focusing on biodiversity, specifically in old and wild forests. And we're just so excited to have her join us tonight to share about biodiversity on the landscape and how that relates to wild places. Welcome, Janet.
Thanks so much, Sophie. It's really nice to be here. I wish I could see you all wherever you are, but I'm glad you're here. So I'm just going to jump right in, and there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So as an ecologist, more and more when I'm out in the world, I'm thinking about what it's like to see the world through another animal's eyes. And I try to imagine how a chickadee, for instance, sees the world. And for instance, they can see UV wavelengths, which allows them to see a lot of colors and textures and contrast that we can't see. They can see fast motion a lot better. They can see small objects in much better detail with multiple focal points over a wider field of view. So this allows them to see all kinds of insects, mites, spiders, beetle wings, things that we just cannot see. And then to tuck them away in crevices in bark of trees, and they can remember, supposedly, according to Sibley, more than 2,000 hiding places at once. So it's a completely different world. And dragonflies are another animal I'm intrigued with. They have 3 eyes. They can see UV and polarized light, and the world goes by at 300 frames a second, which is like stop motion. And their eyes have thousands of focal points. So when they're flying, and they're the fastest known animal in terms of their speed, they can see a single mosquito while they're zipping along. And in terms of their capture rate, they're one of the most successful predators known in the animal world. And they eat a lot of species that our species has likely never seen before. So the richness of these worlds, these visual worlds of a chickadee and a dragonfly, they bring home how little we know about the diversity of life in the Northeast forests and the complex relationships that exist among the species there. Every Northeastern state has a wildlife action plan, and this documents the status and vulnerability of species, native wildlife in those states. But it's usually species that we can readily identify and see: vertebrates, some insect groups, and in some states, vascular plants. Next slide. For example, Maine's plan documents 18 species of amphibians, like this wood frog, and I can't help wonder how it sees the world. 17 species of reptiles, 39 species of inland fish, 61 species of terrestrial mammals, 423 species of birds, and 2,100 species of plants. And this is impressive, but it's also humbling when you stop to think that this is only a tiny fraction of the number of species we estimate live in a forest. Next slide. We're only just starting to understand the critical role some of the less conspicuous species play, especially fungi in the forest. Probably a lot of you have heard about the mycorrhizal networks that connect trees to trees and transfer chemicals and water. And they're basically one of the key engines that power a forest. Next slide. So if you look at everything sort of in context, you can see the things that we know a fair bit about are in the very top part of this pyramid, mostly vertebrates and plants. And then as you go down, the very foundation of what basically feeds everything at the top, we know almost nothing about. And it's that group of species at the bottom that makes up most of the biomass and species richness of our forests. Next slide. So there's entire kingdoms and phyla that we know almost nothing about, like protists, sponges, hydrozoans, flatworms, nematodes, not to mention bacteria and other microbes, that pie chart on the right, where we know basically nothing. So if we were to describe the region's natural history in a book, most of the chapters would be missing. Next slide. Given how little we know, how do we ensure that the full extent of the region's biodiversity is protected? We live in a forested landscape, so understanding the relationships in a forest is key, and that's what I'm going to focus on here, not that there aren't many other types of ecosystems in the Northeast. So when you look up at a forest, you see a complex canopy if it's a mature forest. The trees are very tall, and it's about 100 years before a forest starts to acquire late successional or mature forest characteristics. And you'll see things like very thick branches at the top of a tree and a canopy that might be 20, 30 or more feet above the rest of the forest. And you'll see many, many layers from mosses, herbs, shrubs, subcanopy, canopy, supercanopy, snags. Basically, there's hundreds of microclimates from the forest floor to the treetops. Next. Now, if you look down at the forest floor, you'll see, except perhaps in a closed canopy hemlock or some conifer forest where there's not much of an herbaceous layer, but in a mixed or hardwood forest, you'll see a very diverse herb layer and often a shrub layer. And there have been studies showing that about 90% of the overall species diversity in forests is in this herbaceous layer. And it's incredibly important for pollinators. This also obviously influences insect diversity. Next slide. And then if you look in all the crevices of the bark or on the tree, you'll see hundreds of species of mosses and lichens and fungi where you can barely see them, and also species that occur only on older trees like this moss on the right, which is Nectria, and the one on the left, a lichen, is lungwort, with some fungi sticking out as well. And as a result, in these lower parts of trees in particular, where the soil is moist and the climate's a little more cool, you'll get even greater diversity. But as you go all the way up to the treetops, you'll see a shifting suite of species. Next. Now, people call this logs like these that have been sitting on the forest floor coarse woody material or coarse woody debris, and that's incredibly important for a forest. A down log like this can last as long on the ground as a tree can live, hundreds of years. And that's obviously providing fuel to all the organisms in the soil and mycelium. And also the soils in a forest hold more carbon than everything above ground together, all the trees and plants put together. So this coarse woody debris is a key part of sequestering carbon, for instance, as the climate warms, but also providing a source of food and energy for the whole life cycle. Next. And until recently, right now I'm doing some work up on the Allagash, I haven't really thought about water to the extent that I should, but forests are critical to the health of streams. There have been a lot of studies done by the Nature Conservancy and other that look into what they call material contribution areas, a geeky term, but all the little seeps and streams at the headwaters, the ephemeral ones that are starting to dry out already, are of critical importance to the stream, to the downstream portions, because they supply all the nutrients. So they basically provide the material that feeds the entire downstream food web. Next. And they're especially important, floodplain systems where you end up with all kinds of microhabitats coming and going, shifting over the course of a year. But still, as with flora and fauna, in our wildlife action plans, we tend to focus on the wider, more scenic portions of streams and rivers, when really it's the headwaters that are probably the more important part of the system. And obviously these bigger, more beautiful areas, I guess, to our eyes, are only a small part of the picture. Next slide. So this one you'll have to look pretty closely at, but as we get better technology, I don't know if you're familiar with LiDAR, but allows us to map the contours of the land in detail. So the image on the left shows the drainage that, well, basically there's finer contour levels, and so you can see drainage patterns much more clearly. And the one on the right is a regular 7.5 minute topographic map that I've been using my entire working life. Thank you. But the map on the left shows probably more than several hundred miles of small streams. A lot of them are ephemeral or seeps. And the one on the right has only 3 streams, and it only maps permanent streams. So there's 3 permanent streams. This is feeding into the arm of Chamberlain Lake, which is a major lake in the Allagash watershed. So when I started to, this person who helps me with maps, look at what's really going on with water, it completely changed how I looked at the system. The forests are so crucial to keeping those streams cool. And in this particular case, it's a very important cold water fish habitat, one of the deeper lakes in the northern part of Maine. And it's all those seeps that are feeding in cold water. This summer, last summer, I did a lot of my field work barefoot, just walking along the edges of these lakes. And whenever there was a seep, I could feel it because it's about 5 to 8 degrees cooler than the lake water. So we don't really understand all these relationships, but my point here is that it's really complicated, and we have to look at the whole picture to get a better understanding of how forests and water relate. Next slide. And as I said, these riparian habitats, floodplains, seeps, and beaver flowages are incredibly important part of the forests in the Northeast. And beavers are another system that I hadn't really paid that much attention to until, well, one tract of land I've been working on, 600 acres. I've had to slep my canoe over 70 dams and have found 7 lodges, 7 colonies of beavers just in that habitat. This is a new dam that they were making while I was there, or a new flowage. And beavers are a keystone species, incredibly important to the ecosystem. And one thing I'll mention here in case I forget later, we often think of them as a nuisance, and there's a growing, or I should say a constant tension between people who think that they're warming up the water so trout don't like them, and others who think we really need the water in the first place, especially as we start getting drier summers. So beavers are often managed separately without thinking of them as part of the ecosystem as a whole. Next slide. So I'm going to jump a little bit to today's forests, and this will be a main focus since that's mostly where I work. But this is a view from Sentinel Mountain, which is in Baxter State Park, looking at the North Maine woods. And we have a tendency to take the present look of things to be normal. And most people see a sea of trees and don't think about what's missing. And each successive generation has a different baseline. So we call this, or refer to it as, a form of ecological amnesia. And I'm finding, as I talk to younger foresters, they have a completely different concept of what a natural unmanaged forest looks like, because they don't see forests with all the layers. Next slide. And I can't help but see what's changed. This is a view of land along the Allagash, and in the foreground is within the restricted zone where no harvesting is allowed, and there hasn't been any cutting since 1970 when the waterway was established. And behind is commercial forest land. And the difference is pretty stark if you really look. You see this sort of ragged canopy with some super canopy spruce and pine in the foreground. And if you look behind, it's pretty smooth, and you can't really compare the heights because you're looking front to back, but quite a bit lower than what you see in the foreground here. And these two canopies, basically the forest in much of Maine has been homogenized and simplified. In this slide, you get a sense of how much more complex it is near the water. Next slide. In the last 2 years, I've had a chance to fly from central Maine all the way up to the St. John River, which forms the northern boundary, 3 times. And it had been probably a decade since I'd flown a lot of the northern part of the state. But what I found is that almost the entire forest is managed like what you see here. Basically, there's one prescription now. There used to be prescriptions for uneven age management, 2-age stands, that kind of thing. And now you're seeing this pretty much everywhere. What that means, I don't know. We're also seeing along the Allagash more plantations, which are monocultures, obviously, and much shorter rotations. So the implications of this for biodiversity, I don't know people who are really looking into it now, but to me, it points out the value of, again, that riparian strip there along the river where you have an older stands is going to become increasingly important. Next slide. Another thing I thought a lot about while I was up in the Allagash, because there's a lot of low elevation land that's pretty wet. There's a lot of cedar up there, different types of cedar community types. And these are really important for streams and keeping water cold. When I was doing my barefoot field work, whenever I'd walk near a cedar seepage forest, it was even colder than anywhere else. And they often have a sort of a seepy layer of water through the growing season. And they're important habitats in their own right, but I don't know about other states, but in Maine, the northern half of the state, as you know, is unorganized towns, and we have certain regulations around wetlands and that kind of thing, but nothing pertains to forested wetlands. So they can be harvested without, and you don't need to leave buffers. There's no protection, but these are critically important. Again, when you do the water connection, they rise to even higher level. Next slide. And this is an example of how we treat wetlands in our state. And the top, the red area, is one of the largest peatlands in the whole northwestern part of Maine, called Ellis Bog. But part of that system is cedar and spruce, and you can see that that's all been cut in the foreground, and a very narrow buffer has been left, even though this is all one ecosystem. So we don't treat them that way. We don't protect land that way, and in part because we just can't afford to. But I see that as a problem because, again, as the climate changes and we're thinking more and more about keeping water cool, we have to start thinking a little differently about how we're managing forested wetlands, for instance. Next slide. So there's a concept called extinction debt. And what this is the thought is that we don't have a lot of older forests left in Maine. The estimate is that 0.5% of forest in the whole Northeast is old growth. And in Maine, about 4% at most is 100 years or older. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's an age when a forest starts to acquire mature forest characteristics. And also when, as I said, the diversity is much greater in a forest with a lot of structure, uneven age, that kind of thing. So there's a whole lot of species that just simply don't have time to develop. Moss is an example on a forest floor that's opened up every 20 years and might have a canopy that's 50 years old. You're not going to get the diverse moss layer that you used to. So there's growing evidence that forests that are economically efficient, intensively managed, are suffering from a significant loss of biodiversity. There have been studies in Scandinavia in particular, which they're predicting that they're going to lose up to 50% of their species in the next 2 to 3 decades. But the loss isn't necessarily apparent until decades after the harvest, because species move slowly, especially those that require specific habitats. Next slide. So we're paying attention to some species like spruce grouse, marten, wood turtles. All of these are in decline in much of the Northeast. But this is the tip of the iceberg. The species like mosses, fungi, insects, and herbaceous plants are the ones that are being most affected, for instance, in Scandinavia, and I suspect are being most affected here, although this is something we have not yet begun to look at in our area. Next slide. And climate change is accelerating this process, and we can't really understand how. Birds are probably the best bellwethers. They move relatively quickly. I know up in northern Maine, there's now turkeys and vultures and species that weren't there a couple decades ago, and I'm sure where you live, you're seeing new arrivals all the time. White-footed mouse are another species that's moving north. And it's likely that we'll lose some species even by mid-century, but certainly by late century, like chickadees and loons, or probably pretty likely brook trout, if we stay on the current climate change trajectory. So species are moving, and I feel much more quickly than I ever anticipated. I feel like every year I see something new where I live, and then I'm sort of struggling to hear the bird that I used to hear. Next slide. So the bottom line is we really need large tracts of unmanaged or lightly managed forests to stem this tide. Mac Hunter, who's a forest ecologist, taught at the University of Maine for decades, proposes that we protect all current stands that are more than 140 years old and start strategically designating relatively old stands, say 80 to 140 years old, to become old forest. We need these areas because they provide the refuges or source areas for species to move out of back into forests that are being managed around them as they grow older. Next slide. So as an ecologist, and I imagine many of you are dabbling or maybe are ecologists but are familiar with a lot of what I've told you, it's hard to, and there's red flags flying everywhere. There are a number of threats that I hadn't really begun to think about until recently, and I think our culture and society has. And then one is simply an increasing development pressure. The Northeast is, according to the latest IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change study, going to be the most habitable place in the entire United States as the climate warms. And we're already seeing where I live, a lot of people are coming up from the south because the heat index is becoming intolerable in the summer months. It's so high, you can't cool down. So a development boom, housing crisis, that'll be exacerbated by climate refugees, whether they're from in-state or out. And as I said before, we need older unmanaged forests for all kinds of reasons. Forests by themselves keep things cooler, they sequester carbon, and they'll be the habitat that helps buffer some of the impacts on a lot of the species here. And I feel like commercial forest management is taking us in the other direction. As I said, I feel rotations are getting shorter. The prescriptions are shrinking to basically 1 or 2. And overall biodiversity is going to be impacted as a result, where you have forest management on a large scale, or commercial forest management. So I see that as an issue that we're really not talking about, at least not in Maine. Energy infrastructure, we have to transition as fast as we can away from fossil fuels to renewables. But I feel strongly that we shouldn't damage what intact landscapes remain. And we should be, exhausting rooftops and road verges and even putting solar and transmission lines before we start clearing forests to provide energy infrastructure. Managing water, we're a fairly well-watered region, and there are more and more eyes on the water in our lakes and rivers. And keeping forests intact is a key way to keep water and streams intact. And then another threat is mining. In Maine, they've recently found rare earths and lithium up near the Allagash and in other parts of the state, and I'm sure there's many deposits yet to be discovered. How we deal with that, I'm not sure, but it's yet another thing on the horizon that could impact our forests. Next slide. So a way forward. I feel like we need to ramp up conservation efforts, at the same time that development is wrapping up in the region, housing shortages and the like. But we need to focus at a landscape scale and focus on connectivity. This map shows where some of the major migration corridors are in our region, and through the Appalachian chain is critical here. But connecting landscapes and large landscapes is key, and focusing on intact watersheds, especially the headwaters, which is, again, something that I feel like we haven't really focused on until recently. And a lot of you probably heard of the 30 by 30 initiative, protecting 30% of our forests, and including commercial forest land, but undeveloped land by 2030. That's a big ambitious goal, but to push us towards doing that, and in that part of that strategy, which has been adopted by the United Nations and by the Biden administration and by the Mills administration in Maine, is to protect roughly 12% of land that's not managed for commercial uses. But I like to think of an analogy of the Appalachians as kind of the trunk of where we we already are and where we continue to protect the largest tracts, but then have branches from that trunk connecting to other parts of the region rather than all these isolated little pieces. A big job. I think the key also is trying to work together rather than in our own silos. There's so many conservation groups and we're all doing our own thing to a large extent. And I feel like we've got to figure out how to partner to get a lot of this work done. And I'm sure that is happening in many areas. So I don't know, I guess I'm optimistic in many ways that, well, we live in a region where there are many intact landscapes, and I feel like there's a surge of energy in the conservation community on the need to do this work. So I guess I'd urge you all to get on board and help. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet.
You're welcome.
I love imagining you trumping through the Allagash wilderness in your bare feet, sensing the differences in the ecosystem through the soles of your feet. So we'll transition to the question and answer portion of our evening. I'll kick us off with 3 questions, and if any of you audience have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A, again at the bottom of the screen, or wherever your toolbar is. So to start off, Janet, you talked about the Allagash wilderness quite a bit, and during the past 2 years, Janet has actually spent 80 days working on an ecological assessment of this place. So we wanted to hear what your time in that area taught you.
Thank you. It was my dream job. Really fun, except that now I'm writing it up, and that's not my dream job, but that's part of the work. I guess the biggest thing I've learned is how little I know. I never worked in a region quite that large. I mean, it adds up when you look at the watershed, because I'm thinking about the river within that context. 1 million acres, or close to 1 million acres. And pretty much all my working life I've compartmentalized, and I'll go do an inventory of a certain type of peatland, or catalog all the plants and animals, or birds, and or the easy ones, that is, or natural communities, and describe a place that way. But I feel like with the Allagash, I have to think in terms of relationships. It doesn't make sense to do that up there, even though we've done a little bit of that, I'll confess. But basically, it's just been really humbling. And for those of you who haven't been there, it's an incredibly rare and important place. I mean, I feel like it's what Baxter is to alpine communities, or the White Mountains, or the Adirondacks. That's what it's like for wetlands. There's just incredible wetland diversity there.
It's now on my list to visit for sure, after hearing about it from you and seeing all those beautiful photos. So you've also shared with us that you've been doing a lot of thinking and learning about how humans view nature. And I was curious if you could share how this informs your work.
Man, that's a big question. I think one of the first things is, there's still a lot of groups that have a human-nature dichotomy, and I feel like there is no human-nature dichotomy. We are part of nature, and so that is probably the biggest thing. And the only reason we need conservation organizations is to protect land from ourselves, but we're part of it. So that's one of the things I've definitely integrating to what I do. And one thing I know, John Leibowitz at Northeast Wilderness Trust has talked about having wilderness areas be more than just places for adrenaline rushes, I think is how he put it, or in my mind, aerobics, or even aesthetics. We don't think of it as a two-way relationship. So when I say non-hierarchical, we're not above it, we're in relation to it. So that's involved me untangling all kinds of lessons that I've learned in school or as a child, to try not to compartmentalize, try not to just focus on what's obvious, but mostly to try to think about that relationship, and are we only taking, whether it's for our own fun, or are we giving something back? So I guess I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned a little bit about some ways that you see humans making a difference and some of your top priorities. I was curious if you could just share the biggest conservation challenges and opportunities that you see going forward if you had to rank them.
Well, I used to teach until recently a climate change class to high school students. And one of the exercises I'd have them do was a carbon footprint exercise. And they'd have to plug into this online thing, the size of their house, how they heated it, what it was built with, where they got their food, how much gas they used in their cars, how many miles they flew, probably 50 different metrics. And then it would tell you how many Earths we need if everybody lived like you. And I did that exercise, and for me, it was 3.6 Earths. And I am a conservationist, and I've always, we built our house, we were sort of backlanders. I think of myself as very conservation minded and living in a conservative way. And that brought home to me that I've been living my life at my own children's expense. And not to mention all the other species on the planet. So, this is not the standard message I put out there when I'm doing my work for different organizations, but I feel like we have to start shining a light on ourselves and how we live our lives. We have to think about how to live on the planet in a sustainable way. Especially probably a lot of the people here, myself included, I'm guessing, are living an above average lifestyle. But if we can live that way in a way that doesn't destroy what's around us, so that we're not forced to conserve these remnants, I think that's the key. The biggest challenge is trying to shift from our normal to a new normal. And I feel like a new normal can be just as wonderful. If we're not just so preoccupied with material things and that kind of thing. So that's my short answer.
I love that. And even keeping in mind that the new normal, shifting our life ways, can be beautiful and wonderful. It might be like that. So we've got a bunch of questions from the audience. Thank you all so much for chiming in. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So let's start off with a question from Wallace. Wallace would love to know that if you had to recommend one book or two or three, especially on this topic that you've been talking about, do you have a couple favorites to share with us?
Boy, that's hard. I tend to think more in terms of articles, but I personally love books like, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the woman who wrote the book about mycorrhizal fungi,
Suzanne Simard?
Suzanne Simard, yeah, her book, I can't remember the name. I just finished one called Eager, Beavers and Why Their Lives Matter, I think, by Ben Goldfarb. But I love that kind of book that kind of delves into how different animals, or in Suzanne's case, trees, the relationship piece, and Finding the Mother Tree, that's the book, thank you. But boy, I should think about that one. Right now I'm so immersed in about 50 books all tied to things that relate to the Allagash. There's a wonderful book, this seems like a kind of esoteric one, on eels. Eels are really important in the Northeast. It's called Eels. But it's a really fun read, and it takes you all over the world, a species where we still don't know, can't close their life cycle. They breed in the Sargasso Sea. There hasn't been an eel seen on the Allagash since the 1960s because of the dams on the St. John. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about all the time, and those are the kinds of books I like to read. But sorry, I can't give you one.
No, multiple is great. I'm really fascinated by the eel book. I would love to check that out. And I'll add one more. It's based here in Vermont, and it's called Our Better Nature. And I believe the subtitle is something like Hopeful Excursions in Saving Biodiversity. And I thought I'd throw that out there because often, with all the doom and gloom, this book just brings up some practical things that are happening here in Vermont that would be applicable across the Northeast. So I thought I'd share that one as well.
That made me think of one more. I've been doing a lot of work on with the Wabanaki in Maine, because obviously their presence is really important here. And Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell is another good book that kind of contrasts our different value systems, and sort of sheds light on how we got to where we're at. There's a lot of wisdom in it. So there are a number of books like that. Robin Kimmer, Kimmer's books, Braiding Sweetgrass. There's a couple of really good ones along those lines. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so our next question comes from Bart, who shared that there was a paper in Nature, the journal, published last April that documented huge declines in many species of interior forest bird species. It was a huge landscape scale study. And are you concerned with about the huge declines, regardless of whether the species is officially protected or not?
Yes. I know, I mean, if you're paying attention, there's so many species that aren't in the forest around me anymore that used to be there. And it's so much quieter. And I also noticed a shift in caterpillar species, which are a lot of what these forest songbirds eat. So it's all connected. There's some papers about huge declines in insect populations all over the world. So there's obviously some connections, not to mention habitat loss, but it's, as I said, I think of birds as sort of almost the most obvious first shift, because we tend to notice them, they're brightly colored and we're paying attention. But, one of the big factors with birds is simply cats. In the United States anyway, I don't know if that's true in other parts of the range. So, that's a problem that could be, I feel like we could do some work to help alleviate.
Absolutely. And you brought up insect declines, which is our next question. Jack is wondering if you could talk a little bit about insect diversity and the importance of how diverse the insect families are, and whether, as a whole, are insects considered keystone species?
Well, that's a good, I would say pollinators are probably considered keystone. I mean, the world cannot survive without them, or at least all of the vertebrates. In terms of how diverse, I forget what was in that little pie diagram, but there's way more insects than anything else. In terms of, vertebrates, I think vertebrates were 600 species in the Northeast, and invertebrates, which includes insects, were 16,000 plus. And we think it's probably way more than that. So, but the insects are sort of what are making the world go round in a way. But again, I don't think we notice too much, helping to recycle and decompose soil and put no nutrients, from a forest standpoint. Those caterpillars are feeding the birds. It's all frogs, and you name it. It's all related again. And I feel like the farther down that pyramid you go, probably the more important that group of organisms is. I don't know if anyone really has studied it that way, but it just seems intuitive. We don't even understand the relationships like of ants, for instance, but even just thinking about bees, which we're paying attention to, obviously they're of critical importance to us as far as agriculture, but also pretty much everything else that feeds things higher up in the food chain.
And you make such a good point about the decomposers and all those itty bitty critters in the soil that we don't get to see, versus the pollinators are so flashy, and they're both important. They're all important, and you get into this in your paper and in your talk of how even the tiniest microorganisms are a part of the system. So on the topic of birds, are you aware of bird species that are specific to intact or older forests?
I think there's quite a few. Things that need cavities to nest in. There can be cavity trees in a younger forest scattered about, but a lot of the woodpeckers, owls. There's a bunch of warblers like golden crowned kinglet, blackburnian, a number of them that like taller conifer canopies to breed in. And, I'm not, I think a lot of these species can live in like a mid-successional forest potentially too, as long as there's some cavity trees and that kind of thing scattered about, but they generally need some of those categories. And I'm seeing a note here about wood thrush. There's a lot of species that need forest interiors, undisturbed forest floors, so that things like skunks and raccoons and dogs and cats can't go that far in. So all the ground nesting birds, for instance. So I think there's probably a lot of species that would prefer that and are getting by in mid-successional, but my guess is we'll start to see some declines because we don't have that taller tree canopies, conifer forest. Spruce grass is another species that's declining in northern Maine, although that's not tied to the age so much as we're starting to lose stands of spruce.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Greg about the emerald ash borer, and they're already here in Vermont and other states in the Northeast. We know that that will be a huge change to our forests to lose the ash trees. And Greg is wondering how the loss of the ash will affect the overall functioning of northeastern forests.
Wow, I can't say I'm an expert on that. It depends on which forest, I suppose, and how much of a component ash is. But, along with ash, we have the hemlock woolly adelgid, and we have species affecting white pine and beech. Now we have a new disease that affects even the young beech, not just, the suckers that come out. So, the forest is already changing so much because of pathogens. And I feel like it's the number of species moving in is going to continue. So, I think it's going to have a big impact, but not just the emerald ash borer. When you add it all up in the forest, I don't know which species are going to be able to adapt to a lot of the introduced invasives that are moving in, or the species like gypsy moth, for instance, that are moving north. It's a lot of stress on the forest. So I really don't know. I wonder about how resilient trees can be. I've heard that they can actually produce chemicals in their leaves when there's an insect outbreak that reduces their palatability. They can sort of send a message around through the mycorrhizal fungi. So we'll see how trees adapt. The issue is the pace of change. It's quicker than it's ever been. It's just the glaciers left. So we'll see. Not a happy answer.
Yeah, one thing I've heard it doesn't take away the pain of losing the ash trees, but will be a boon to the forests is if those ash trees are not harvested and taken out of the forest and they die in the forest, that some of that structure of old standing snags and lots of coarse down woody debris, there will be a sudden influx of that, and that creates a lot of structure and habitat that largely is missing from the region, exactly what the kinds of forests that you were talking about, Janet. So again, still a tragedy, but there is that interesting component of how will that affect forest structure. Pete is wondering if you could talk about the importance of connectivity, so the landscape protected areas connecting to each other, particularly the protecting of some parcels that might not have high habitat value otherwise, but they still connect lands to one another.
Hugely important, to connect, because like I was saying, species need to move, and not just the ones we are really paying attention to, like mammals and birds. Even things like mosses or lichens or some insect species that don't fly, they have to migrate. So the more connected, the better. And also, the idea of connecting water, so you're not just protecting the downstream portion, you're protecting the headwaters that are feeding into it. It's critical at the ecosystem level, for sure. And in my mind, almost anything but a monoculture or a plowed field has habitat value. And eventually things will grow older and more complex once you've protected them, or if you're managing them in a way that allows for some of that to happen. So I think connectivity is, if you just do isolated pieces, you're not going to have what you have now probably in 50 years or 100 years. And not that that matters. You're going to have a different suite of species. So that connectivity is critical.
Thank you. I love this question from Kevin, who is wondering if there are any naturalists or scientists who were inspirations for you and might have influenced the line of work that you chose to do.
Oh, that's good. Well, when I started working, I've been doing this my entire adult life, or even before I graduated from college. It was a wide open world. Maine, we didn't know where anything was. There hadn't been any rare plant inventories, or very few peatland inventories, old growth forest inventories. So there was this whole cadre of people my age, 20, hired on $600 contracts through the Critical Areas Program, and to do this work. We go off and just find things, and then we write reports about them. So for me, it was almost more like the camaraderie of that group that inspired me, just all learning together, and kind of a wide open field. And there's many people that are mentors to me in terms of, for me, this will seem kind of weird, but a guy named Brian Doyle, he's a novelist, unfortunately he's no longer here, who wrote Mink River, Martin, and a book of essays, and another, Barry Lopez, you might have heard of, some of his essays. The people that are paying attention. As a matter of fact, Barry Lopez had a quote in there that I like to use about paying attention as being the most sincere form of generosity, when you truly pay attention. And I feel like, so words of people, I think, more than being in the field, or I guess the biggest mentor for me, honestly, is just going outside and paying attention.
Absolutely. Nature is the most powerful teacher of them all, and available when you need her. David and Joshua had somewhat similar questions, so I'm going to take the liberty of combining them. They're curious about galvanizing people, kind of like you have for us tonight. Do you find that there are things that are best for getting people excited, especially if maybe they haven't had the fortune of experiencing a wilderness place firsthand?
Oh, that's a good question. Boy, if they haven't had a chance, there's a whole huge segment of our population, often those that aren't as privileged, who haven't had a chance and can't even think about this stuff. And I think about that a lot, which is why I think we have to focus a spotlight on ourselves, those of us who can afford to think differently. But I had to give a talk on climate change in Lincoln County with my two daughters are musicians. It was accompanied by music, and we'd done that kind of thing a couple of times. But at the end of it, we just gave a prompt and said, talk to your neighbor. What is it you would change? What would be the next step you would take tomorrow based on what you've heard today? And we couldn't get people to stop talking. It was like 20 minutes later, it's like, okay, we got to close the theater now. So I feel like what I think will inspire people is to be more community minded and to talk to each other and figure out ways to bring people together to talk. As a matter of fact, after that particular show, some said, I want to get some people together in town to just talk about this. And there was another girl, a young girl, who said, can we get our class together to just talk about it? I feel like that's a good first step, because it's easy to get mired down by people like me talking or reading things. It can get pretty depressing. And unless we think about our own little actions one step at a time. That was another thing somebody said, a woman who started the Maine Youth for Climate Justice in Maine, young woman, she's in 9th or 10th grade. She said, let's just take one step at a time. So that doesn't really answer the question in terms of the wilderness aspect, but I see them as all connected, you know, again, not compartmentalizing, and forming relationships, whether it's with other people or paying more attention to what you see around you and how you have an effect on that.
Beautiful. Yeah, and just acknowledging where we all are at. So we're closing in close on 6:30. I think we can fit in one more question. Um, I've mostly got hardball questions left, so I hope that's all right.
Right. I'll try.
Okay. So Bart brings up that there's a lot of support out there for increasing old growth forests, and Northeast Wilderness Trust is an organization that does that through passive rewilding. That's our forte. There's other ideas out there that more young forest is needed, and so that habitat should be created through management. And he's asking if you're familiar with this and if you have any thoughts on the topic.
I'm not sure I completely understand. I mean, certainly, given that only at most 4% of our forest is over 100 years old, we're talking about young forests. So, I mean, I do think you can manage forests. There's something called exemplary forest practices, some of you might have heard about, and New England Forestry Foundation, you know, there's a lot of people trying to do forestry in a way that is very sensitive to biodiversity. So I think that if on commercially managed land, hopefully we can provide incentives or encourage people to go that way. In terms of just say you have a piece of young forest and you're going to conserve it and you don't need the income from the timber, I feel personally like a forest knows how to be a forest. You know, I constantly see people manage, like, if you like trout, you don't like beavers, or if you like deer, you hate coyotes, you know, whatever it is, we're always trying to manage with one species in mind. And I feel like we honestly, again, don't understand all the relationships needed to really do that. I mean, that's not to say like you've got a forest crowded out with bush honeysuckles or something. There might be things you might want to try to do to allow a forest to grow in the first place. But I don't really know enough about some of the sort of more active restoration work that's being done, but I tend to be a bit of a skeptic because, again, I feel like just watching pretty much all the forests I work in are second, third growth forests, and they seem to be on their way to recovery without active intervention. So, but others know more than I do.
Well, what you just said is very in line with what Northeast Wilderness Trust describes to. A forest has wisdom that predates the existence of humans on this planet, and yeah, nature has her ways of healing and coming back, and so it's fun to watch that evolve on the landscape. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Janet, and thank you to everybody in the audience for being here tonight. It was great to have you.
Thank you.